Chicago, 11:47 p.m., on a freezing November night. The black SUV door slammed shut like a prison cell. "I'm not Scarlett," Chloe screamed, pressing herself against the leather seat. "You kidnapped the wrong woman." Across from her, Mafia boss Dante Vance slowly leaned out of the shadows. His jaw was clenched, his obsidian eyes burning with exhausted rage. "Wrong woman," he whispered. "You shot my guard, stole $5 million and disappeared." Chloe's face drained of color. "Scarlett is my twin sister. I haven't seen her in 5 years." Dante suddenly threw a black handgun onto the glass table. "Clang, then pick it up," he ordered. "Show me the hands that pulled the trigger." Chloe stared at the weapon, trembling while Dante's expression suddenly changed. Because her hand was missing the one scar his wife could never hide. "Where is the scar, Scarlett?" he demanded. And then Dante's phone rang. A woman's voice whispered through the speaker. "Hello, husband. Did you enjoy my replacement?" What happens when a ruthless mafia boss realizes his missing wife has sacrificed her own twin sister to escape? Stay with us as the truth explodes, and subscribe. Like and comment before we begin. Cold rain slicked the Chicago pavement. Chloe Bennett clutched her worn wool coat tighter against the November chill. She just wanted to go home. Her feet ached from 10 hours on her feet. Her accounting ledger felt heavy in her cheap canvas tote. She worked hard for her quiet life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. She believed in earning her way. She believed in treating people with respect. Footsteps echoed behind her in the narrow alleyway, heavy, deliberate, rhythmic. Chloe quickened her pace. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the damp brick walls. She reached for her keys. Her fingers fumbled in the cold. Cold metal slipped against her freezing skin. A hand clamped over her mouth. It was a massive hand. It smelled of expensive leather. It carried the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of gunpowder. Chloe screamed. The sound died instantly against the thick leather glove. Another arm banded around her waist like a steel vise. She was lifted entirely off the ground. Her sensible boots kicked at the empty air. Panic seized her chest, raw, violent, suffocating. She fought back with everything she had. She elbowed the solid wall of muscle behind her. A low grunt rumbled in the dark. "Still fighting, Scarlett." Even now, the voice was a dark, silken drawl. It held a terrifying, exhausted familiarity. Scarlett. Her sister's name, the twin sister she hadn't seen in 5 long years. The sister who chased money and power into the shadows, leaving Chloe behind to care for their dying mother and a mountain of medical debt. Before Chloe could shake her head, the world blurred. She was shoved hard into the back of a waiting armored vehicle. The doors slammed shut, the locks engaged with a heavy, final click that sounded like a prison cell sealing shut. Chloe gasped for air. She scrambled backward against the buttery leather seats. The interior of the SUV was massive. "Dark, quiet. I'm not Scarlett." Chloe choked out. Her voice shook violently. "You have the wrong person." A figure sat in the opposite corner. Shadows masked his face, but the glow of passing streetlights caught the sharp angles of a tailored suit. And a pair of eyes that looked like shattered obsidian. Dante Vance. Chloe didn't know his name yet, but she knew exactly what he was. He radiated violence. He carried a quiet, absolute authority that sucked the oxygen right out of the air. Dante leaned forward. The streetlights illuminated a face that was brutally handsome, yet completely devoid of mercy. He looked at her worn coat. He looked at her sensible shoes. His lip curled into a cynical sneer. "The thrift store aesthetic is a nice touch, wife," Dante murmured. His tone was lethal. "But it doesn't buy you a pardon. Listen to me," Chloe pleaded. She pressed her hands flat against the expensive leather seat. "I am Chloe Bennett. I live in a walk-up in Logan Square. I do taxes for small businesses. I believe in the law. You cannot just take people off the street like this. Human beings aren't property you can just throw in a trunk. Every person has rights. Every life has value." The words sounded desperate in the dark car, but they were deeply true to her. Chloe believed in the inherent value of human life. She believed in basic dignity. It was the only moral compass she had. Dante stared at her for a long, suffocating moment. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Then he laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that held zero humor. "Human rights," he repeated softly. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "You shot my head of security in the chest. You stole $5 million from my personal vault. And you left my men to bleed out on the cold floor. You forfeited your humanity the moment you pulled that trigger. Scarlett, don't preach to me about the value of a life when you treat them like poker chips. Chloe's breath hitched, shot a man. $5 million. Her sister hadn't just married into the mob. She had gone to war with it, and she had left a trail of blood. It wasn't me, Chloe whispered. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. I value life, any life. I would never hurt anyone. Please, look at my hands. She held them up in the dim light. They were shaking, small, unscarred, and heavily calloused from typing on a keyboard for 12 hours a day. Not the hands of a killer. Dante didn't even glance at them. He just leaned back into the shadows. Keep playing the victim, it won't save you tonight. The SUV turned sharply, the tires crunched onto heavy gravel, through the tinted glass. Chloe saw a sprawling stone estate rising from the darkness. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress built on fear. High iron gates, armed guards patrolling the perimeter with assault rifles. The implied reality was bleak. This was a place where human value was measured only by loyalty or death. The vehicle rolled to a stop under a massive portico. The driver, a mountain of a man with a heavily scarred neck, opened Chloe's door. He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her out into the freezing rain. Chloe stumbled, her knee hit the harsh gravel. The guard yanked her up with unnecessary force. Careful, Chloe gasped, looking directly up into the guard's hardened eyes. You don't have to hurt me. I can walk, I'm just a person. Just like you. The guard froze. He blinked, utterly confused. His grip loosened just a fraction. In his violent world, weakness was an invitation for more pain. Empathy was a completely foreign language. He looked at Dante, unsure how to handle a captive who asked for simple decency instead of screaming violent threats. Inside, Dante commanded. His voice cut through the rain like a sharp blade. Chloe walked. She held her head high despite the sheer terror crushing her lungs. She would not let them strip her of her dignity. That was her only armor against these monsters. Dante led her through a cavernous foyer. Stark marble floors, cold, vaulted ceilings. The house staff backed away immediately, pressing themselves against the walls. They looked at Chloe with pure, unfiltered terror. They looked like rabbits staring down a wolf. What did you do to these people? Scarlett thought. Her stomach churned. It was sickening. These people lived in constant, agonizing fear of the woman whose face she wore. Dante marched her up a grand sweeping staircase. He shoved open a heavy set of double doors and forced her inside a massive, sterile master bedroom. Your closet is exactly as you left it, Dante said. He pointed to a massive dressing room. Take off those pathetic rags. Put on something fitting for the queen of this syndicate. We have a lot of missing money to discuss. I won't wear her clothes, Chloe said softly. Defiance flickered hot in her chest. They aren't mine. I am not your property. Dante stepped right into her space. The heat of his anger radiated against her damp skin. He was so close she could see the profound exhaustion etched deeply around his dark eyes. He was a king of the underworld. But he looked exactly like a prisoner of his own making. You will wear what I tell you to wear. You will be exactly who I tell you to be, or the men downstairs will handle you. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out, locking the heavy mahogany door behind him. Chloe was completely alone. She walked slowly into the massive closet. It smelled of heavy, expensive perfume. Rows of blood-red silk dresses hung in the dark like open wounds. She stripped off her wet, cheap wool coat. She felt terribly vulnerable, exposed to a world she didn't understand. She pulled a dark crimson robe from a velvet hanger and wrapped it tightly around her waist. It felt freezing against her skin. It felt like a lie. She walked back into the main bedroom. The heavy lock on the door clicked. Dante walked back in. He had removed his tailored suit jacket. His shoulders were broad, rigid with tightly coiled tension. He didn't look at her face. He walked straight to the expensive glass vanity. He pulled something from his waistband. Cold metal clattered loudly against the glass top. Chloe flinched backward. She stared at the object. It was a handgun, matte black, heavy, lethal. Dante turned slowly to face her. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away every defense she had left. He pointed a long finger at the weapon. Let's see if your trigger finger is as fast as it was when you shot my guard. The gun sat on the glass vanity, cold, heavy waiting. Chloe didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stared at the matte black weapon. Dante stood behind her. His massive frame filled the mirror. He was waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for the sociopath he married to pick up the steel and point it at his chest. Chloe slowly lifted her chin. She met his dead, obsidian eyes in the reflection. I won't touch it, she said. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. I don't kill, I don't solve problems with violence. You can threaten me all night, but I am not her. Dante's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder. He snatched the gun off the glass. He holstered it at his waist in one fluid. Practice motion is in 10 minutes. Wear the red silk. He walked out. The door didn't lock this time. It didn't need to. The armed guards in the hallway were lock enough. Chloe changed. The crimson dress felt like ice against her skin. It clung to her. It smelled like expensive perfume and old lies. She walked down the grand staircase. Her legs felt like lead. The dining room was a cavern of dark mahogany and harsh chandelier light. Dante sat at the head of the long table. He was drinking bourbon. He didn't look up when she entered. Chloe sat at the opposite end. A plate of seared steak sat in front of her. Her stomach rolled. Eat, Dante commanded. I'm not hungry, Chloe replied. Silence stretched. It was a physical weight in the room. Dante set his crystal glass down. The ice clinked. It was the only sound. You used to love the northern roots. Dante murmured. He cut a piece of steak. He didn't look at her. You spent 3 weeks up there last year. Negotiating, bribing border guards. Chloe froze. She didn't know anything about northern roots. She knew about tax brackets. She knew about deductible expenses. I don't know what you are talking about. Chloe said. Funny, Dante continued. His voice dropped. It became a low, dangerous rumble. Because you had a disagreement with a rival crew up there. One of them pinned your right hand to a table. With a combat knife. Chloe stopped breathing. Dante stood up. He walked slowly down the length of the long table. His footsteps were silent on the thick rug. He stopped right beside her chair. He reached down. He grabbed her right hand. He didn't squeeze. He just held it flat under the harsh, unsparing light of the chandelier. His rough thumb rubbed firmly over the webbing between her index finger and thumb. He traced the smooth, pale, unbroken skin. He then ran his thumb over the side of her middle finger. He felt the heavy, thick calluses. Calluses formed by years of gripping a cheap ballpoint pen. Calluses from pounding away on a desktop calculator. The blade went right through, Dante whispered. His grip tightened just enough to trap her. It took 12 stitches, left a nasty, puckered scar. He dropped her hand. It hit the mahogany table with a dull thud. Dante stepped back. The exhaustion in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a profound, dangerous confusion. He stared at her hand. Then he stared at her face. Where is the scar, Scarlet? He asked. The silence pressed down on them. And why do your hands feel like they belong to someone who has never fired a gun in her life? Panic seized Chloe's throat. She squeezed her eyes shut. Tears finally spilled over her lashes. I told you, she choked out. Her voice was a broken rasp. I told you in the alley. I am not her. Dante dragged a hand down his face. The impenetrable mask of the ruthless boss shattered. He looked at the ceiling. He let out a long, sharp breath. Fiona, he said. He tested the name. But he remembered the alley. No, Chloe. Chloe Bennett. We haven't spoken in 5 years. Chloe sobbed. The words tumbled out. She had to make him understand. She left when our mother got sick. I stayed. I paid the bills. I buy generic brand cereal. I don't know anything about guns, please. You have to let me go. Dante didn't answer. He turned away. He walked to the massive windows overlooking the dark, rain-swept lawn. $5 million. He murmured to the glass. A dark, cynical chuckle vibrated in his chest. She didn't just steal the money. She left a breadcrumb trail. He turned back to look at Chloe. His expression hardened into something jagged and cold. My men found a neon pink butterfly clip in the alley, Dante said, right where we grabbed you. It was perfectly placed, catching the streetlight. The realization hit Chloe with the force of a physical blow. Her stomach bottomed out. Acid burned the back of her throat. The butterfly clip, it was hers. She had dropped it weeks ago. Scarlet must have picked it up. Scarlet hadn't just vanished. Scarlet had orchestrated the whole thing. Her own sister had used her as a decoy, a fleshy speed bump to slow down a monster. Scarlet fed her to the wolves to buy a head start. Chloe clamped a hand over her mouth. A ragged, terrible sound tore out of her throat. She bent forward. She pressed her forehead against the cool edge of the table. She set me up, Chloe gasped, her lungs seized, my own flesh and blood. She threw my life away for paper money. Breathe, Dante ordered sharply. Chloe couldn't. She was hyperventilating. The edges of the room turned gray. The betrayal was absolute. It fractured something fundamental inside her chest. How could anyone do that to another human being? How could a sister look at a sibling and see nothing but a tool? Heavy footsteps closed the distance. Rough hands grabbed her shoulders. Dante hauled her upright. He pushed her head down between her knees. "Breathe, damn it," he commanded. "I am not having you pass out on my floor," Chloe gasped. She pulled the sharp scent of his cologne into her lungs. She fought the panic attack with stubborn practicality. After 5 agonizing minutes, the shaking subsided. She sat up slowly. Dante was watching her. The lethal rage was gone. Now he just looked calculating. "Do you kill me now?" Chloe asked. Her voice was hollow. "Because I know your face. Because I'm useless to you. Killing you yields 0 return on investment." He crossed his arms. "And it doesn't solve the problem of my missing wife." "Then let me go. I can't do that either." He tilted his head. "If my men find out my wife robbed me blind and disappeared, they will smell weakness. Weakness invites challengers. Challenges invite a war. I am not fighting a street war over a treacherous spouse." He leaned closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "We are going to use you to flush her out. We are going to make sure the street whispers that Scarlett Vance is back, firmly in power. It will drive her insane. Her ego won't allow it." Chloe stared at him in horror. "I can't be her. I don't know how to be a monster. Someone will figure it out, and they will kill me." Dante walked to a side table. He picked up a thick black leather binder. He tossed it onto the dining table. It slid to a stop right in front of her. "Then you better study," Dante said. "Your sister is a sociopath. She has a photographic memory for grievances. She considers empathy a biological defect. You need to strip away everything that makes you a decent human being." Chloe looked at the black binder. It looked like a tombstone. "No," Chloe said quietly. She looked up at Dante. "You're wrong." Dante's eyebrow twitched. "Excuse me, you think stripping away my humanity will make me strong?" Chloe said. Her voice gained a fraction of heat. "But it just makes you empty. Look at where it got you. Your own wife sold you out. You rule by fear, but fear isn't loyalty. Dante, fear is just a cage. And the second the door opens, the animals bite." Dante stared at her. The silence was deafening. No one spoke to him like that. No one dared. He didn't yell. He didn't pull his gun. He just looked at her with a strange, guarded fascination. "Read the file, Chloe," he whispered. The sound of her real name on his lips felt like a spark in the dark. "Your education begins tomorrow." Morning arrived with the harsh, gray light of a coming storm. Chloe sat in Dante's private study. The heavy wool blanket around her shoulders offered no warmth. The black binder sat open on the massive oak desk. She had spent the entire night reading. It was a textbook on human misery. Pages of photographs, names, leverage. Notes in Scarlett's elegant, looping handwriting detailing violent encounters and ruined lives. Chloe felt physically sick. She closed the binder. She rubbed her burning eyes. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Dante stepped in. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms corded with dense muscle. He looked at the closed binder. Then he looked at her pale face. "Time to go to work," he said. 10 minutes later, Chloe's was standing in the center of the library. She wore a tailored black blazer and a crimson blouse. The silk felt like armor. The doors opened again. Elias walked in. He was Dante's right-hand man, tall, lean, eyes like a hawk looking for a dying mouse. 2 massive enforcers followed Elias. They were dragging a man between them. They threw the man onto the Persian rug. He landed hard on his knees. He was trembling violently. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit. He clutched a briefcase to his chest like a shield. Elias announced. His voice dripped with disgust. "He runs the books for the Southside Transit Hub. We caught him skimming. 10 grand over the last 2 months. Chloe looked at Leo. The man was sobbing. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked pathetic. He looked terrified. "The traditional penalty," Elias said, looking directly at Chloe, "is a severed finger for every 1,000 stolen. Should I get the bolt cutters?" "Boss," Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. 10 severed fingers, mutilation. "For money," she looked at Dante. He was leaning against the bookshelves, arms crossed, watching her, waiting to see if she would play the monster, waiting to see if the bookkeeper could become the butcher. Chloe took a slow, deep breath. She channeled her terror into a cold, flat stare. "Leave the room, Elias," Chloe said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the heavy silence of the library. Elias frowned. "He needs to be made an example of." "I said leave the room," Chloe snapped. She mimicked the sharp, aristocratic irritation she imagined Scarlett possessed. "Or do I need to explain the chain of command to you again?" Elias stiffened, his jaw locked. He nodded once stiffly. He gestured to the enforcers. They dropped Leo and walked out. The heavy doors clicked shut. It was just Chloe, Dante, and the weeping man on the floor. Chloe walked around the desk. She didn't march. She glided. She stopped 2 feet away from Leo. "Stand up," she said softly. Leo scrambled to his feet. He couldn't look her in the eye. He kept his gaze locked on the tips of her expensive heels. "Why did you take it?" Chloe asked. I got greedy. I made a mistake." "Please, Mrs. Vance, please. Don't lie to me, Leo," Chloe said. Her tone shifted. The icy facade dropped just a fraction. It was replaced by something grounded, something observant. "You're wearing a suit that's 5 years old. Your shoes have holes in the soles. You didn't steal 10 grand to buy a watch or hit the casino." "Where did the money go?" Leo sniffled. He finally looked up. He saw something in Chloe's eyes that confused him. He didn't see the devil. He saw a woman calculating a spreadsheet. "My daughter," Leo choked out. The fight completely drained out of him. "She has cystic fibrosis, the medical bills. The insurance dropped us. The pharmacy wouldn't release her breathing treatments without cash up front. I didn't know what else to do. I was going to put it back." I swear to God, the air in the room shifted. Chloe felt a painful, sharp twist in her chest. Medical bills, a sick family member, the crushing, desperate weight of an impossible system. She knew that weight. She had carried it for her mother. She looked over at Dante. His face was a blank mask. He was observing, calculating. Chloe turned back to Leo. $10,000, Chloe said. She walked over to Don's desk. She opened the top drawer. She pulled out a thick stack of banded, crisp $100 bills. It was petty cash for a monster. It was life or death for a father. She walked back to Leo. She pressed the stack of cash into his trembling hands. Leo stared at the money. His mouth fell open. He looked up at her in sheer, unadulterated shock. "Pay the pharmacy," Chloe instructed quietly. "Clear the debt. Buy her the medicine." "I don't understand," Leo stammered. "You don't steal from this family," Chloe said. She kept her voice firm, but stripped it of all cruelty. "You ask if your family is sick. You bring it to us. You work for Dante. That means your family is under his protection. Do you understand me?" Leo fell to his knees. He wasn't pushed this time. He collapsed out of pure, overwhelming gratitude. Tears streamed down his face. "Thank you," he sobbed, clutching the money to his chest. "Thank you. My life is yours. I swear it. I will never betray you. Go," Chloe said softly. Leo scrambled up and ran out the door. The library was dead silent. The rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows. Chloe stood in the center of the room. Her hands were shaking. She turned to face Dante. Dante pushed himself off the bookshelf. He walked slowly toward her. His eyes were wide, the dark obsidian was fractured, revealing a storm of conflicting emotions underneath. "What did you just do?" Dante whispered. "I solved an accounting error," Chloe replied defensively. She crossed her arms over her chest. "He was a desperate man. A severed hand doesn't pay you back. It just makes an enemy. You showed weakness," Dante argued, but there was no heat in his voice. "The street will hear about this. They will say Scarlett has lost her edge." "Let them," Chloe shot back. She stepped closer to him. She refused to back down. "Look at what you do, Dante. Look at the fear you demand. It forces good men to lie. It forces them to steal just to keep their children breathing. That isn't power, that's a sickness." Dante stared down at her. His chest rose and fell with a heavy breath. "You think giving away my money makes me strong?" he asked. "I think recognizing the value of a human life makes you a leader," Chloe said fiercely. "Did you see his face? Did you see his eyes? That man will never betray you now. He will step in front of a bullet for you. Because you gave him his dignity back. Fear breeds traitors. Empathy breeds loyalty." Dante looked toward the door where Leo had exited. He remained silent for a long time. The brutal reality of his world told him she was wrong, but the profound, unshakable certainty in her eyes told him she was right. He looked back down at Chloe. The sharp, cynical mobster was gone. He just looked like a man waking up from a very long, very dark nightmare. "You are an incredibly dangerous woman." "Chloe," he murmured, "because I care. Because you make me want to care," Dante answered. He turned and walked to his desk. He didn't look back, but the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The armor was cracking. The red silk felt like a straitjacket. Chloe stood in front of the full-length mirror in her dressing room. She stared at her reflection. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her makeup was sharp and dramatic. She looked exactly like Scarlett. She pressed her hands against the cool glass of the mirror. She hated the woman staring back at her. She hated the luxury built on blood money. She hated the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that vibrated in her bones every second of every day. Most of all, she hated how easy it was becoming to put the mask on. A knock sounded at the door. It didn't open, it waited. That was new, Dante never knocked. "Come in," Chloe called out. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Dante stepped inside. He wore a dark charcoal suit. Minus the tie, he looked exhausted. He always looked exhausted. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her reflection in the glass. "We have a problem at the shipping yards," Dante said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. "Marcus Thorne's cartel is undercutting our wages. The dockworkers are threatening to strike. Elias wants to send a crew down there tonight with baseball bats to remind them who signs their checks." Chloe turned around. She leaned against the vanity. "And what do you want to do?" she asked. Dante rubbed the back of his neck. It was a remarkably human gesture. "A week ago, I would have told Elias to break the union boss's kneecaps. It's efficient. It sends a message," but Dante looked at her. Really looked at her. "But then I think about Leo. I think about the look on his face when you handed him that cash. Beating men into submission doesn't make them work faster. It just makes them sloppy." Chloe felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "So don't beat them," Chloe said softly. She walked toward him. "Look at the ledgers. You have a massive surplus in the offshore accounts. Marcus Thorne rules by fear, just like you used to. If you increase the dockworkers' hazard pay by 15% and offer full medical coverage, Marcus won't be able to match it." Dante frowned. "You want me to outbid a cartel with benefits." "I want you to treat your workers like human beings." Chloe corrected. "You offer them security. You offer them dignity. They will shut Marcus out of the port themselves. You won't have to fire a single shot." Dante stared at her. The sharp lines of his face softened. He let out a low breath. "You are going to bankrupt me." "Chloe, I'm going to legitimize you." She shot back. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Dante's mouth. "Get your coat. We're going to the docks. We will try your diplomatic approach." An hour later, the black-armored SUV rolled to a stop at Pier 42. The air smelled of diesel fuel and rotting fish. The sky was the color of bruised iron. A cold wind whipped off the gray water, slicing right through Chloe's heavy wool coat. Dante stepped out. He walked around the vehicle and opened her door. He didn't grab her arm. He offered his hand. Chloe hesitated. She looked at his large, scarred palm. Then slowly she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, protective. They walked toward Warehouse 7. Elias and 3 enforcers trailed behind them. Elias looked furious. He clearly hated this new, softer the union boss. A massive man named Sullivan stood outside the corrugated metal doors. He looked nervous. He was expecting baseball bats. Dante stopped a few feet away. He kept Chloe tucked slightly behind his right shoulder. Dante said. His voice was calm. "Reasonable. We need to talk about the wages." "The men are starving, Mr. Vance." Sullivan blustered defensively. "Marcus is offering a flat rate that we can't ignore." Chloe stepped forward. She gently pushed past Dante's arm. "Marcus Thorne will pay you a flat rate for a month," Chloe said clearly. "Then he will cut it in half. And if you complain, he will throw you in the harbor. You know that, Sullivan. We know that." Sullivan swallowed hard. "Then what are you offering?" "A 15% increase in hourly hazard pay," Chloe said, reciting the numbers flawlessly. "And a fully funded health trust for the union members and their immediate families. Effective by midnight tonight." Sullivan's jaw dropped. Elias cursed under his breath behind them. "You're serious?" Sullivan asked, looking between Chloe and Dante. "I sign the checks," Dante said smoothly. He looked at Chloe, his eyes full of a strange, proud warmth. "And my wife has convinced me that a healthy workforce is a profitable workforce. Do we have a deal?" Sullivan didn't hesitate. He held out a massive, calloused hand. "We have a deal. Marcus Thorne won't move a single crate through this port." Dante shook the man's hand. Chloe exhaled a shaky breath. It worked. They resolved a war with an Excel spreadsheet and basic human decency. She looked at Dante. He looked back at her. For the first time since she was thrown into the trunk of his car, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man capable of change. Suddenly, the deafening crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the quiet harbor. Concrete exploded just inches from Chloe's boots. "Sniper!" Elias screamed, drawing his weapon. Time slowed down to a crawl. Chloe froze, her ears ringing from the concussive echo. She looked up at the rusting cranes lining the pier. A small flash of light flared in the gray mist. Dante moved with terrifying speed. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't dive for cover. He lunged directly at Chloe. His massive body collided with hers. He wrapped his arms around her waist, twisting them both in the air. He put his own broad back between her and the distant crane. A second shot cracked through the air. Dante grunted, a sharp, violent exhalation of breath. They hit the wet concrete hard. Dante took the brunt of the impact, shielding her head with his arm. The air was knocked completely out of Chloe's lungs. Gunfire erupted all around them as Elias and the enforcers laid down, suppressing fire toward the cranes. Dante, Chloe gasped. She scrambled out from under him. Dante was kneeling on the concrete. He had one hand pressed firmly against his upper left shoulder. Dark, thick crimson blood was seeping rapidly between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt. "I'm fine," Dante gritted out through clenched teeth. His face was stark white. "You're shot," Chloe panicked. She grabbed his arm, pressing her own hands over his to staunch the bleeding. Her hands were instantly covered in his blood. Dante looked at her frantic, terrified face. Despite the bullet in his shoulder, despite the chaotic gunfire echoing around them, his obsidian eyes were incredibly calm. "Are you hit?" he asked hoarsely. "No," Chloe sobbed. "No, you covered me." "Good," Dante whispered. He slumped forward slightly, his forehead resting against hers. Chloe held him tight. The red dress beneath her coat was ruined. Her hands were stained, but in that chaotic, terrifying moment, a profound realization struck her. He didn't shield her because she looked like Scarlet. He shielded her because she was Chloe. He had taken a bullet to protect the woman who had just taught him how to be human again. The armored SUV tore through the wet city streets. The engine roared. Tires slicked against the dark asphalt. In the back seat, the air was thick with the copper scent of blood. Dante leaned heavily against the leather door. His face was gray. His breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. He kept his right hand clamped over his left shoulder. Dark blood seeped continuously between his thick fingers. It stained his crisp white shirt a terrifying crimson. Chloe pressed her hands directly over his. She pushed down hard. "Keep pressure on it," Dante grunted. He squeezed his eyes shut. "I am," Chloe said, her voice shook. Her hands were completely covered in his blood. It was warm and slippery. "You're going to be okay. Just stay awake." Elias was driving. He took a sharp corner at 60 miles an hour. The heavy vehicle fishtailed slightly before catching traction. "I told you going to the docks was a mistake," Elias barked from the front seat. He looked at them through the rearview mirror. His eyes were furious. "Marcus Thorns doesn't respect hazard pay. He respects bullets. You made us look weak, boss, and now you're bleeding for it." "Shut up and drive," Dante ground out. Chloe stared at Dante's pale face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He had thrown himself in front of a high-powered rifle for her, a ruthless mafia boss, a man who supposedly valued nothing but power. He had used his own body as a human shield to protect a terrified bookkeeper. 10 minutes later, the SUV cleared the heavy iron gates of the estate. They didn't go to a hospital. Mafia bosses didn't go to emergency rooms. They went to sterile, hidden rooms in their own fortresses. Elias and another guard hauled Dante out of the car. They practically carried him up the grand staircase. Chloe followed closely behind. Her legs felt numb, her hands were stained red. They brought him to the master bathroom. It was massive, cold white marble and blinding lights. They sat him on the edge of the large porcelain tub. "Get the kit," Dante ordered Elias. His voice was getting weaker. Elias pulled a heavy metal lockbox from under the vanity. He popped it open. "Gauze antiseptics." "Suture needles," he set it on the counter. "I'll call the private doctor." "No," Dante snapped. He opened his eyes. They were completely lucid despite the pain. "No one comes onto the property tonight. We have a leak. Marcus knew exactly where we were standing. We lock the gates. Nobody gets in or out." Elias hesitated. He looked at Dante's bleeding shoulder. "Boss, I can't stitch that." Chloe stepped forward. She didn't think about it. She just acted, Chloe said. Elias looked at her. He scoffed. "You're going to pass out just looking at it. Scarlet, get out of the room," Dante commanded. The authority in his voice left no room for debate. Elias glared at Chloe. Then he turned on his heel and marched out. The heavy door clicked shut. It was just the two of them. Chloe walked to the sink. She washed her trembling hands with scalding hot water and antibacterial soap. She watched the blood spiral down the drain. Then she turned back to Dante. He had managed to strip off his ruined shirt. His torso was corded with heavy, scarred muscle. The bullet wound was high on his shoulder, a clean through and through. The sniper had used armor-piercing rounds. That was the only reason Dante was still alive. If it had hit center mass, he would be dead. Chloe picked up a thick pad of gauze. She poured brown antiseptic over it. This is going to burn, she warned softly. Do it, he said. She pressed the soaked gauze directly into the open wound. Dante's entire body went rigid. A low, feral growl vibrated in his chest. His uninjured hand gripped the edge of the marble tub so hard his knuckles turned white. But he didn't pull away. Chloe worked quickly. She cleaned the entry and exit wounds. Her hands were remarkably steady now. The panic had receded, replaced by a deep, stubborn need to fix the broken thing in front of her. She threaded the curved surgical needle. Why did you do it? Chloe asked quietly. She pierced his skin. He flinched, but stayed still. Do what? You jumped in front of me. You took a bullet that was meant for my head. Chloe tied off the first stitch. She looked up into his eyes. You don't care about me. I'm just a hostage. I'm leverage against your wife. Dante watched her face. He tracked the gentle, precise movements of her hands. You aren't a hostage, Dante murmured. The pain medication Elias had left on the counter was starting to kick in. His guard was dropping. You're the only real thing in this entire house. Chloe's breath hitched. She tied off the second stitch. That doesn't answer the question. You saved Leo, Dante said simply. He stared at the white marble wall. You looked at a man who stole from me, and you saw a father who needed help. You looked at a corrupt union boss, and you saw working men who needed dignity. You see the value in people, Chloe, even people in the dark. He turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes were intensely vulnerable. If that sniper had killed you, Dante whispered, the only light left in my world would have gone out. I couldn't let that happen. You are worth saving. A warm, heavy ache bloomed in Chloe's chest. She finished the last stitch. She taped a clean bandage over his shoulder. She stood close to him. He reached up with his good arm. His large, calloused hand cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed gently over her cheekbone. Chloe didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch. The monster was gone. Underneath the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation, he was just a man. A man desperate for a better way to live. They stayed like that for a long time. Quiet, safe. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was a crisp, clear blue. Dante's shoulder was stiff, but the bleeding had stopped. He insisted on attending a morning briefing downtown. He needed to project strength. He needed the city to see that the sniper had failed. Chloe dressed in a sharp black suit. They walked out to the portico together. A fresh armored sedan was waiting. The driver stood by the open rear door. Chloe walked to the car. She reached for the door handle. Then she stopped dead. Her blood ran entirely cold. The crisp morning air suddenly felt suffocating. Hanging from the rearview mirror inside the car was a small, silver object. It caught the morning sunlight, glittering sharply. It was a silver locket. It was cheap. It was scratched. It was the locket Chloe's father had given her when she was 10 years old. Scarlett had stolen it from her apartment years ago out of pure spite. Chloe stared at it through the glass. Her lungs forgot how to work. Dante stepped up behind her. He noticed her frozen posture. He followed her gaze. He saw the locket. His jaw instantly locked. Scarlett wasn't just sending messages from the shadows anymore. She had bypassed the iron gates. She had bypassed the armed guards. She had walked right up to Dante's personal vehicle in the dead of night. She was inside the perimeter. The illusion of safety shattered into a million jagged pieces. The heavy oak doors of the study slammed shut. Dante hurled his crystal Burmanglass against the stone fireplace. It shattered into dust. The amber liquid hissed against the cold ash. How? Dante roared. Elias stood rigidly in the center of the room. He didn't flinch. The security feeds loop at 30 a.m. for an automated system backup. It takes exactly 90 seconds. Someone knew the blind spot. Someone slipped past the outer patrols, hung that locket in the car, and slipped back out. Chloe sat curled in a large leather wingback chair. She was pulling her own fingers, staring blankly at the floor. Her sister had been steps away from her bedroom. It's a psychological game. His voice was tense. She wants us looking over our shoulders. But worse, the men are talking. Boss. Dante turned slowly. His eyes were lethal. Talking about what? About weakness, Elias stated bluntly. He didn't back down first. Scarlett gives away 10 grand to a thief. Then, you cave to the dockworkers' union instead of cracking skulls. Then, a sniper takes a shot at you in broad daylight, and we retreat. The streets are whispering. They think the Vance syndicate is bleeding out. Dante braced his hands on his heavy desk. He stared at the dark wood. We caught one of Marcus Thorne's scouts an hour ago, Elias said. He was taking photos of our southern supply depot. He's in the basement. Chloe looked up. Her stomach dropped. We need to send a message. Elias pressed. He looked directly at Chloe, a loud one. We need the street to know that Scarlett Vance hasn't lost her teeth. And we need them to know that anyone who crosses this family leaves in a body bag. Dante remained perfectly still. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at Chloe. He saw the pure terror in her eyes. He knew exactly what Elias was asking for. And he knew exactly what it would do to her. But Dante was a king standing on a crumbling bridge. If his men believed he had gone soft, they wouldn't just leave. They would mutiny. They would kill him. And then they would kill the woman sitting in the chair. Survival in the underworld required a terrifying tax. Bring him to the interrogation room. Elias nodded sharply. He left the study. Chloe stood up. Her legs were shaking. Dante, no, please. Dante walked over to her. He took her hands. His grip was tight. Desperate Chloe. Listen to me, he whispered rapidly. If I don't give them blood today, Elias and the capos will turn on us. They will stage a coup by midnight. I cannot protect you if my own men are holding the guns. You want me to hurt someone. Chloe choked out. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You want me to torture a man. I want you to survive, Dante said. His voice cracked with his own agony. You have to put the mask on. You have to be Scarlet, just for 10 minutes. Walk in there, look him in the eye, and give the order. I will handle the rest. I can't. You have to, or we both die. 10 minutes later, Chloe stood outside a heavy steel door in the basement. The air smelled of damp concrete and old rust. Dante stood beside her. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder once. A silent plea. A silent apology. He pushed the door open. The room was bare except for a single drain in the center of the floor. Under a harsh fluorescent bulb, a young man sat tied to a metal chair. He couldn't have been older than 20. He was badly bruised. Blood leaked from a cut above his eye. Elias and two massive enforcers stood behind him. The boy looked up when Chloe walked in. He swallowed hard. The raw fear in his eyes was blinding. He won't give up Marcus Thorne's location, Elias said flatly. Chloe walked slowly toward the chair. Every step felt like walking through deep, freezing water. Her heart pounded a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. She stopped in front of the boy. He looked at her red dress. He looked at her cold, painted face. Please, the boy whispered. His voice cracked. I was just a lookout. I didn't shoot anybody. I just needed the cash. My mom, shut up, Chloe snapped. The harshness of her own voice shocked her. It sounded exactly like the monster she read about in the binder. She stared down at the boy. She saw Leo. She saw human desperation. She saw a life that had intrinsic value, caught in a machine designed to grind bones into dust. But she also saw Elias watching her out of the corner of her eye, waiting for her to flinch, waiting for the final proof that she was an imposter. If she showed mercy, she would be dead by morning. Chloe locked her jaw. She dug her fingernails into her own palms until the skin broke. She forced every ounce of humanity, every ounce of compassion, into a dark locked box in her mind. She looked at Elias break his legs. Chloe ordered. Her voice was terrifyingly blank. The boy screamed. He thrashed against the ropes. No, please, Elias smiled. A cold, ugly smirk. He stepped forward with a heavy iron crowbar. Chloe didn't look away. She forced her eyes to stay open. She forced herself to watch the consequence of her words. This was the reality of power built on fear. It wasn't glorious, it was just sickening. Wet cruelty. The crowbar swung down. The sickening crack of bone echoed off the concrete walls. The boy's scream tore through the room, high-pitched and completely inhuman. Chloe turned on her heel. She walked out of the room. Her posture was perfectly rigid. Her face was a mask of stone. She walked up the basement stairs. She walked through the grand foyer. She walked up the sweeping staircase to her bedroom. She closed the heavy mahogany door. She locked it, then she collapsed. Her knees hit the hardwood floor. She scrambled into the massive marble bathroom. She leaned over the toilet and threw up until her stomach was completely empty. She threw up until her throat bled. She stood up on shaking legs. She turned on the shower. Cold water, as cold as it could go. She didn't take off the red silk dress. She just stepped under the freezing spray. The water hit her skin like icy needles. The red dye from the cheap silk began to bleed, swirling around her feet and spiraling down the silver drain. It looked exactly like the boy's blood. Chloe sank to the floor of the shower. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wrapped her arms around her head. She sobbed, deep, ragged, soul-tearing sobs. She had survived the basement. She had fooled Elias. But she had lost the only thing that mattered. She had ordered the mutilation of another human being to save her own skin. She wasn't Chloe Bennett anymore. The bookkeeper was dead. She had finally become the monster. The bathroom door opened. Dante stepped inside. He ignored the freezing spray bouncing off the marble tiles. He didn't care about his expensive shoes. He walked directly into the massive shower and knelt beside her. He reached out and pulled her shivering, soaking wet body into his chest. Chloe fought him at first. She pushed weakly at his chest. "Don't touch me," she sobbed. "I'm sick. I'm disgusting." "No," Dante whispered fiercely. He held her tighter. He buried his face in her wet hair. "You're not. I made you do that. I put that blood on your hands. I am the monster, Chloe, not you." He let the cold water rain down on them. He held her while she completely fell apart. He saw the utter devastation in her eyes. He saw the exact moment her bright, stubborn morality had cracked under the weight of his dark world. He had done this to her. His empire of fear had required her soul as a toll. Dante felt a profound, violently deep self-hatred. "I'm sorry," Dante murmured over the sound of the running water. "God, I am so sorry." He reached over and turned the water off. He pulled a massive plush towel from the heated rack and wrapped it securely around her shoulders. He lifted her off the cold marble floor. He carried her into the bedroom and set her gently on the edge of the large bed. Chloe stared blankly at the wall. The red silk dress clung to her, ruined and heavy. Dante knelt in front of her. He took her cold, shaking hands in his. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Chloe slowly shifted her gaze to his face. "You were right," Dante said. The words carried a heavy, absolute finality. "About everything. Fear is a cancer. It doesn't protect you. It just rots you from the inside out. I looked at that boy today, and then I looked at your face. And I realized I would rather die than force you to live in this hell for one more minute." Chloe blinked, her breath hitched. "What are you saying?" "I'm tearing it down," Dante vowed. His dark eyes were fierce and unyielding. "All of it. I'm liquidating the offshore accounts. I'm signing the legitimate businesses over to the union trusts. I am dismantling the Vance syndicate." Tonight, Chloe stared at him in disbelief. "Elias will kill you. The Capos will kill you. They can try," Dante said. A grim, lethal smile touched his lips. "But I have the digital keys. Without me, they don't get a single dime. I'm trading the money for our lives." He reached up and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her forehead. "When the transfer is done," Dante continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "we are walking out of those gates. We are leaving the city. We are finding somewhere quiet, somewhere safe, just you and me. I swear it on my life, Chloe." A tear slipped down Chloe's cheek. It wasn't a tear of terror this time. It was a fragile, terrifying spark of hope. For the first time, she saw a future. A life where people weren't treated like currency. A life built on mutual respect. She looked at Dante, and she didn't see a mob boss. She saw a man willing to burn down his entire kingdom just to keep her safe. She leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against his. "Okay," she whispered. Dante closed his eyes. He leaned up and kissed her. It was gentle at first, hesitant. But as Chloe kissed him back, the tension of the past month finally shattered. It deepened into something desperate and profound, a silent promise spoken in the dark. They were two broken people clinging to each other in the wreckage. For the next 2 hours, the estate was quiet. Dante sat at his desk in the study. His fingers flew across his encrypted laptop keyboard. He was transferring billions of dollars out of criminal holding accounts and into untraceable offshore trusts destined for charities and worker pensions. He was erasing his own legacy. Chloe sat on the leather sofa, wrapped in a dry sweater. She watched him. She felt lighter. The crushing weight of the crown was lifting. They were really going to do it. They were going to escape. The nightmare was finally ending. Down in the subterranean security hub of the estate, the air was stagnant and cold. Elias stood behind the two heavily armed guards monitoring the massive bank of camera feeds. "Everything quiet?" Elias asked smoothly. "Dead quiet, sir," the guard on the left replied. He didn't look away from the screens. "Perimeter is secure." Elias pulled a silenced pistol from his jacket. "PFT-2 suppressed shots." Both guards slumped forward onto the control console, dead before they even registered the betrayal. Elias stepped over their bodies. He didn't blink. He felt no remorse. Loyalty was a transaction. And someone else had offered him a much better price for the throne. He leaned over the glowing keyboard. He typed in his high-level override clearance code. On the massive monitor wall, the green dots lining the estate's perimeter wall suddenly blinked. Then simultaneously they turned a harsh, Glowing red, the security grid was offline. Elias reached over and flipped a heavy physical toggle switch. A mile away at the main entrance, the massive reinforced steel gates began to hum. They slowly swung wide open, groaning against the cold night wind. Elias pulled a burner phone from his pocket. He hit a single speed dial number. "The front door is open," Elias said into the receiver. "He's in the study." "She's with him. Make it loud." A woman's voice chuckled on the other end of the line. The sound was elegant, looping, and entirely sociopathic. "Good work," Elias Scarlett murmured. "Let's go say hello to my lovely sister." Elias hung up the phone. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the estate completely defenseless. Up in the study, Dante hit the final execute button on his laptop. The screen flashed green. Transfer complete. The Vance Empire was officially bankrupt. He looked over at Chloe. He smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "It's done," he said. He closed the laptop. "Go pack a single bag. We leave in 10 minutes. Chloe stood up. Her heart soared. She felt like she could finally breathe again. Before she could take a step toward the door, a deafening explosion ripped through the night air. The massive bay windows of the study shattered inward in a tidal wave of glass. The floor shook violently. The booming roar of a breaching charge echoed through the hallways. The gates were open. The enemy was inside, and they had brought an army. The explosion shattered the world. Glass sprayed across the study like lethal rain. The concussive wave threw Chloe violently to the floor. Her ears rang with a high, piercing whine. The smell of pulverized drywall and burning explosives choked the air. Dante was instantly on his feet. He grabbed the collar of her sweater. "He move," he shouted. His voice barely cut through the ringing in her ears. They ran. They pushed through the splintered oak doors and sprinted into the grand hallway. The estate was in total chaos. Alarms blared, gunfire echoed off the marble walls. The syndicate, remaining guards, were exchanging heavy fire with a swarm of men dressed in black tactical gear. Marcus Thorne's cartel. They were inside the house. "The safe room," Dante yelled, pulling her down a side corridor. "We just need to hold out until the local police respond." They rounded a corner. Elias stood at the end of the hall. He held an assault rifle. He wasn't shooting at the cartel. He was aiming directly at them. Dante shoved Chloe behind a marble pillar just as Elias pulled the trigger. Bullets chewed through the stone, showering them in white dust. Elias Dante roared over the gunfire. The betrayal carved a deep, ugly line across his face. "You sold us out. Loyalty is a transaction." Boss Elias called back. His voice was cold, indifferent. "Thorne offered me your seat at the table, and your wife offered me the offshore accounts. You went soft. You tried to build a kingdom on charity. In this world, that just makes you a target." Dante drew his sidearm. He leaned around the pillar and fired 3 rapid shots. Elias ducked into a doorway. "We can't go forward," Dante said. He looked at Chloe. His chest heaved. Blood was seeping through his bandages again. "The back terrace. It leads to the cliffs. We can use the service stairs." They moved fast. Dante covered their retreat. They burst through a set of French doors onto the massive stone balcony overlooking the river. The wind howled. The river raged 80 feet below them, a black, churning nightmare churning against jagged rocks. Before they could reach the service stairs, the doors behind them blew open. 5 heavily armed cartel soldiers poured onto the terrace. Elias was right behind them. "End of the line," Elias yelled. Dante stepped in front of Chloe. He raised his gun, but he was completely outgunned. He looked back at Chloe. His dark eyes were filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. He knew exactly how this was going to end. "I promised you a way out." Dante whispered. "No," Chloe pleaded. She grabbed his arm. "No, Dante. We fight together." One of the cartel soldiers stepped forward. He held a heavy breaching charge. He tossed it directly at their feet. Time stopped. Dante didn't hesitate. He didn't try to save himself. He lunged at Chloe. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist and threw her violently sideways. He tossed her completely clear of the blast zone, shoving her toward the solid stone foundation of the house. The charge detonated. The explosion ripped the balcony apart. Stone shattered into dust. Chloe hit the ground hard. She scrambled to her hands and knees, coughing through the thick, acrid Dante, she screamed. The smoke began to clear. The edge of the balcony was completely gone. A massive jagged hole opened up to the black river below. Dante was gone. Chloe crawled toward the edge. Her hands bled on the broken stone. She looked down into the freezing, turbulent water. There was nothing, just foam and darkness, she sobbed. Her voice tore in her throat. Dante, please. She collapsed on the broken stone. The grief was immediate and suffocating. It crushed the air right out of her lungs. He had traded his life for hers. He had finally found his humanity, and it had killed him. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. Chloe couldn't move. She was entirely broken. A pair of pristine gold stilettos stepped into her blurred line of vision. Pathetic. The voice was elegant. Looping, familiar, Chloe slowly lifted her head. Scarlett stood over her. She wore a flawless, tailored white trench coat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. She looked exactly like Chloe, except for the absolute, terrifying emptiness in her eyes. She held a silver handgun. She aimed it directly at Chloe's face. Scarlett smiled. It was a cold, venomous thing. "You looked great in my clothes, sister," Scarlett purred. "Let's see how you look in a body bag." They dragged Chloe by her hair. She didn't fight back. She couldn't. The world was just a numb, buzzing blur. Dante was dead. The dream of a quiet life was gone. They threw her onto the stark checkerboard marble of the grand foyer. The room was filled with armed men. A massive man with cartel tattoos on his neck stood near the front doors. Elias stood next to him. Scarlett walked down the grand staircase. She moved like a queen reclaiming her throne. She snapped her fingers. A guard brought over a laptop. He set it on a glass table and turned the webcam toward the center of the room. "The remaining capos are on the secure feed," Elias told her. Scarlett nodded. She walked over to Chloe. She grabbed Chloe's jaw and forced her to look at the camera. "Look closely, gentlemen," Scarlett announced to the laptop. Her voice echoed in the cavernous room. "This crying, pathetic creature is the woman who has been giving away your money. This is my twin sister. She is a fraud. Dante went soft and it got him killed. I am taking the syndicate back, and I am purging the weakness." Chloe looked at the camera. She saw the little green light. She knew men were watching all across the city. "You don't understand power," Chloe said. Her voice was raspy, but it was steady. Scarlett laughed. She pressed the barrel of the gun to Chloe's forehead. "I'm holding the gun, Chloe. I think I understand it perfectly." "You only understand fear," Chloe replied. She looked up at her sister. She didn't feel afraid anymore. She just felt an overwhelming pity. "You rule by terror, but fear is fragile. It breaks the second someone realizes they have nothing left to lose." Dante realized that. He tried to change. "You are just a parasite." Scarlett's eyes narrowed. The cruelty flared hot. Scarlett snapped. "Put a bullet in her chest. Let the capos watch her bleed out." Elias raised his rifle. He aimed at Chloe. He placed his finger on the trigger. Then a voice called out from the back of the room. "Lower the weapon." Everyone turned. It was Leo, the accountant, the man whose daughter Chloe had saved. He stood near the archway, holding a shotgun. He was shaking, but his eyes were completely determined. Behind Leo stood a dozen Union dock workers. They held crowbars, heavy wrenches, and hunting rifles. "What is this?" Marcus Thorne growled. He raised his own weapon. "You pull that trigger, Elias," Leo said, stepping forward. "And this whole room goes up. We aren't letting you kill her." Scarlett laughed in disbelief. "You're a pencil pusher, Leo. Put the gun down before I have Marcus skin you alive." "I don't think you will," Chloe said. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor. She looked directly at Scarlett. "Because I'm a pencil pusher, too, and I'm much better at it than you." Scarlett frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The offshore accounts," Chloe said. She smoothed down her ruined sweater. She stood tall. "Dante didn't just drain the criminal funds tonight. I helped him set up the new trusts. We linked the union pensions, the capo retirement funds, and the hazard pay bonuses to a digital dead man switch." The room went dead silent. Elias lowered his rifle just a fraction. "A what? A biometric lock?" Chloe lied smoothly. Her mind raced, pulling every piece of corporate financial jargon she knew. "The money is sitting in a blind trust in the Caymans. It requires my voice authorization every 24 hours to remain open. If I die, the system triggers a liquidation protocol. The money is instantly donated to the Red Cross. Every single dime of your retirement goes up in smoke." Elias looked at Scarlett. Panic flashed in his eyes. "Is she bluffing?" "She's an accountant," Leo shouted. "She knows the books better than anyone. She bought my daughter's medicine. She treated us like human beings. If she dies, we lose everything." The logic struck the room like a physical blow. The cartel soldiers looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Scarlett. "Shoot her," Scarlett screamed. She aimed her own gun at Chloe. "I am your boss. You're a liability," Marcus Thorne said coldly. He lowered his weapon. The loyalty built on money and respect was holding. The fear was breaking suddenly. The massive mahogany front doors blew completely off their hinges. Smoke billowed into the foyer. A figure stepped through the wreckage. He was soaked to the bone. His clothes were torn. He was covered in mud and blood. He held a heavy tactical shotgun in one hand. It was Dante. He had survived the river. "Drop the weapons," Dante roared. His voice was absolute thunder. Behind him, heavily armed tactical units poured into the room, not FBI tactical teams. Chloe had used Dante's laptop to send the offshore ledgers directly to the federal authorities before the attack began. The room erupted into chaos. Cartel soldiers dropped their guns, realizing they were surrounded by federal agents. Scarlett panicked. She lunged at Chloe. Raising her gun, Dante fired a single shot from his shotgun. It hit the chandelier above Scarlett. The massive crystal fixture crashed to the marble floor, shattering between the two sisters. The impact knocked the gun out of Scarlett's hand. It slid across the floor, spinning until it hit Chloe's shoe. Chloe looked down at the silver weapon. She bent over. She picked it up. She aimed it directly at her sister's heart. The foyers was completely still. The FBI agents held their fire. Watching the standoff, Dante stood near the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Chloe. Scarlett lay on the marble floor, surrounded by broken crystal. She looked up at the barrel of the gun, for the first time in her life. The sociopathic smirk was completely gone. She looked terrified. "Do it," Scarlett hissed. She scrambled backward. "Pull the trigger, Chloe. Show them you're exactly like me. Show them the bookkeeper is a killer." Chloe stared down the sights of the weapon. Her hands were perfectly steady. She felt the heavy, cold metal. She felt the absolute power of life and death resting on her index finger. It was intoxicating. It was the exact power Dante had wielded for years. She thought about the boy in the basement. She thought about Dante falling into the river. She thought about the endless cycle of blood and misery this woman had caused. It would be so easy to end it. "You think this makes us the same?" Chloe asked quietly. "Blood is blood." Scarlett spat. Chloe looked over at Dante. He was watching her. He didn't say a word. He was letting her choose her own soul. Chloe took a slow, deep breath. "You're right," Chloe said. "Blood is blood, but I value it, and you don't." Chloe shifted her aim slightly to the right. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot deafened the room. The bullet slammed into the massive glass table holding the laptop and the physical backup drives Elias had brought in. The glass shattered. The drives sparked and died. The last remaining copies of the cartel's blackmail files were destroyed. Chloe lowered the gun. She dropped it onto the floor. It hit the marble with a dull, hollow clatter. "I'm not a murderer," Chloe said, looking down at Scarlett. "I'm just the woman who finally balanced your books. You're bankrupt, sister." Federal agents swarmed forward. They hauled Scarlett off the floor, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. Marcus Thorne and Elias were already being dragged out the door, screaming threats that no one cared to listen to. Chloe didn't watch them go. She turned and ran across the ruined foyer. Dante dropped his shotgun. He caught her as she slammed into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. He was freezing cold. He smelled like river mud and gunpowder, but he was alive. "You didn't shoot her," Dante whispered into her hair. His voice was thick with emotion. "I couldn't let her take my humanity," Chloe sobbed, gripping his torn shirt. "It's the only thing I have left. It's the only thing that matters," Dante said. He pulled back and looked at her face. He reached up, his thumb wiping a streak of dirt from her cheek. "I thought I lost you. You can't get rid of me that easily." Chloe smiled through her tears. The lead FBI agent walked up to them. He looked at Dante. "Mr. Vance." The agent said, "We have the ledgers. We have the wire transfers. You handed us Marcus Thorne and your own syndicate on a silver platter. The immunity deal is active. But you have to understand. You owe nothing now. The properties, the cars, the accounts. It's all gone." Dante looked around the ruined, opulent mansion. He looked at the shattered glass and the blood on the floor. He looked back at Chloe. "I have everything I need," Dante said. 6 months later, the fog rolled in thick off the Atlantic Ocean. The air smelled of salt and pine needles. Chloe stepped onto the wooden porch of the small, weathered cabin. She wore a thick, hand-knit sweater. She held 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. She looked out toward the property line. Dante was kneeling in the damp grass. He wore faded jeans and a heavy flannel shirt. He was holding a hammer, driving a long nail into a broken wooden fence post. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. A large, jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, a permanent reminder of the sniper's bullet and the river. He finished driving the nail. He stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He turned and saw her standing on the porch. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a face completely free of shadows. The exhaustion that used to haunt his dark eyes was gone. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who finally owned his own soul. He walked up the steps and took a mug from her hands. "The neighbor's dog won't be getting into our garden anymore," Dante said. He took a sip of the hot coffee. "Mrs. Higgins will be thrilled." Chloe laughed. She leaned against the wooden railing. "She baked us another pie yesterday. I think she has a crush on you." Dante chuckled. He wrapped his free arm around Chloe's waist and pulled her close. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. They stood together in silence, watching the ocean crash against the rocky Maine coastline. There were no armed guards. There were no steel gates. There were no ledgers written in blood. "I was thinking," Chloe said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "The community center downtown needs a new financial director. Their books are a mess. I might volunteer." "They would be lucky to have you," Dante said. He rubbed her arm to keep away the morning chill. Chloe looked up at him. "You know, Elias used to say that power was about how many people feared you." Dante looked out at the water. His expression was calm. "Elias was an idiot. Fear just builds a prison. And eventually, you end up locking yourself inside." "So what is power then?" Chloe asked, though she already knew the answer. Dante looked down at her. He thought about Leo. He thought about the dock workers. He thought about the woman who had walked into hell and refused to let it burn her. "Power isn't about how many people you can force to their knees," Dante said softly. He pulled her a little closer. "True power is about how many people you can help stand back up." Chloe smiled. She turned her face into the cold ocean wind. She was Chloe Bennett, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And so Chloe Bennett's story did not end inside a mansion filled with shattered glass, blood-stained marble, and the remains of a criminal empire. It ended on a quiet wooden porch beside the Atlantic Ocean, where there were no armed guards, no secret accounts, no enemies hiding behind steel gates, and no one measuring human lives by how useful they could be. Chloe entered Dante's world as an innocent woman mistaken for her ruthless twin sister, but she left it as something far greater than a victim. She became the living proof that compassion is not weakness, mercy is not surrender, and kindness can be more powerful than any weapon. From the beginning, everyone around Chloe tried to convince her that survival required cruelty. Dante believed fear was the only language his enemies understood. Elias believed loyalty could always be purchased by the highest bidder. Scarlet believed blood, power, and money gave her the right to sacrifice anyone who stood in her way, even her own sister. But Chloe understood something none of them did. People may obey fear for a time, but they will never truly belong to the person who terrifies them. Fear creates silence, resentment, and betrayal. Respect creates loyalty. Mercy creates devotion. And dignity can transform a frightened servant into someone brave enough to stand against an entire army. When Chloe saved Leo's daughter instead of punishing him, she did more than forgive a stolen $10,000. She gave a desperate father a reason to believe his life still mattered. That single act of compassion later returned to her when Leo and the dock workers placed themselves between her and death. This is one of the greatest lessons of the story. The good we give to others is never truly lost. We may not see its value immediately. We may never know which kind word, generous decision, or moment of understanding will change someone's life. But kindness plants loyalty in places where fear can never reach. Chloe also teaches us that the most important battles are not always fought against visible enemies. Sometimes the hardest battle is the one fought inside ourselves. In that final moment, Chloe stood over Scarlet with a gun in her hands and every reason to pull the trigger. Her sister had betrayed her, stolen from her, used her as bait, and tried to destroy the man she loved. Revenge would have been understandable. Violence would have been easy. But Chloe realized that killing Scarlet would not defeat her. It would only allow Scarlet's darkness to live inside her. By lowering the weapon, Chloe protected the most valuable thing she still possessed, her humanity. That choice reminds us that we are not defined by what others do to us. We are defined by what we choose to become afterward. Pain can explain our anger, but it does not have to control our future. Betrayal can break our trust, but it does not have to destroy our goodness. And revenge may satisfy us for a moment, but it can never return the parts of ourselves that hatred consumes. Dante's journey carries an equally powerful message. He began as a man who believed control was the same as strength. He had wealth, armed men, influence, and a reputation that made entire neighborhoods tremble. Yet he was not free. His empire was a prison, his followers were waiting for weakness, and his marriage was built on manipulation rather than love. Chloe did not change Dante by defeating him or fearing him. She changed him by showing him another way to live. She forced him to see that leadership is not about how many people will kneel before you, but how many people will rise because you helped them. Dante's redemption did not erase the damage he had caused, but it proved that change begins once a person finally stops defending their darkness and takes responsibility for it. He gave up his fortune, his kingdom, and his old identity because he discovered that owning everything means nothing when you no longer own your soul. His greatest victory was not surviving the river or defeating his enemies. It was choosing to become a man worthy of the woman who saw goodness in him before he could see it in himself. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of Chloe and Dante's story. Love is not about rescuing someone while allowing them to remain unchanged. Real love holds up a mirror. It challenges cruelty, demands accountability, and inspires both people to become better than they were before. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.